down to the bottom of the ocean. It's taken a while to get there. And then at the very bottom of the ocean, what's it look like in your mind's eye as it's kind of rocking gently back and forth? With that picture in your mind's eye, let's go ahead now and play the game of Section 4, Death by Water.
Phlebas the Phoenician, a fortnight dead, forgot the cry of gulls and the deep sea swell and the profit and loss. A current under sea picked his bones in whispers. As he rose and fell, he passed the stages of his age and youth, entering the whirlpool. Gentile or Jew, O you who turn the wheel and look to windward, consider Phlebas, who was once handsome and tall as you.
Okay, let's play the game of this one. Notice we begin with Phlebas. When we hear the Phoenician, and we know that the title of this section is Death by Water, we're back to the drowned sailor of Madame Sosterus and her pack of cards with her tarot cards, right, and all of that. Notice this Phoenician, who was a great sailor, right, a great warrior. They were the great sailors, right. Notice he's now been dead for 14 days, which is, of course, ironic, fortnight dead, 14 days, because, of course, if he's Phoenician, he's been dead for a whole lot longer than that, right? Notice the word forgot. You might circle it, you might star it, and in fact, this is really a poem about forgetting, isn't it? It's a poem about the inability to remember, but it's also a poem about forgetting. What did he forget? Well, all the things he knew in his life. The cry of gulls, the deep sea swell, the profit and loss. In other words, when you're dead, you don't care. This is our Scrooge story, isn't it? You don't care about the money once you're at the moment of your death. Notice the fun of the word profit. Think about that. When you read it, you know that the word profit here means gain. When you hear the word profit, you immediately think of Tiresias, the blind prophet, the genius of Eliot, right? A current under sea picked his bones in whispers. This notion of whispering comes from the Hollow Men, right? When we whisper together, quiet and meaningless. As he rose and fell, he passed through the stages of his age and youth. The notion that your life is a series of stages. In other words, right before you die, you have a tendency to kind of relive your whole life. And here it is for him. He's entering the whirlpool. We think about Yeats in his Gyre, from both Second Coming as well as sailing to Byzantium. You can look at those texts, obviously, on Burnstrong as well. And then finally, Gentile or Jew, which, by the way, encapsulates all people. Okay, Gentile, Jew just simply means all people. O you, notice the personal point of this poem now, this section, who turn the wheel and look to windward. In other words, all of us that kind of have a tendency to look towards the future with some kind of expectation. Consider Phlebas. He's kind of like a working model, right? Who was once handsome and tall as you. Well, let's play the game really quickly of what's going on here. You've got, obviously, it's very beautiful poetry. It's easier, maybe more accessible, some might say, right? That notion of death has undone so many we come back to, right? And now at 2a, no one gets out of this critique, right? All of us are included. As we have often said in 303, you ain't met no 200-year-old people, right? Which is a significant realization. The only difference between you and a fly is you know about fly swatters. Think about that, right? In other words, you know that at some point this is going to come for you. And here it is. Nobody gets out of this. At death, right, we won't care about profit and loss. What will we care, right, about? At 2b, hear all the rhymes. Did you hear it? For example, swell, fell. All the way through this reading, it's a beautiful reading for that point as well. At 3a, we've mentioned Yeats, again, Baudelaire and Whitman and Thoreau come to mind. Those poets that kind of reach out and speak to you, yeah? Right? Go back to that Baudelaire, to the reader. You, hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère. Nah, you're just like me, I'm just like you, as we read it, right? Well, at 3b, we've said this often in our study of Plato's Republic. We said it, right? Socrates' insight, that at the moment of death, remember he said it, the unexamined life is not worth living, right? The unexamined life is not worth living. You'll remember that he makes the observation that at the moment of death, all humans pretty much think the same thing. back for our study of Phaedo. The words are all the same. We all speak the same words. The words are, oh my God. The only question is the inflection of the voice. What does Scrooge tell us? The ghost takes him to his past. Not interested. Takes him to his present, to the present time. Really gets more mad. Not interested. That third ghost shows up in Scrooge's story of the Christmas Carol, Dickens' Christmas Carol, though. The third ghost shows up, doesn't say anything. Dressed all in black. Who's the third ghost? Well, that's Death. Where's he take him? Graveyard. What's he showing? His own tombstone. Fascinating. It's at that moment the multi-billionaire Scrooge is ready to just simply fall down on his knees and beg for one more day. Why? Well, he comes to the moment of his death and he says the words, oh my God. It's the inflection. Oh my God, what have I done with my life? If I could just have another moment. Here you have that same game being played, right? So when we talk about 3B, obviously the question is, what are your thoughts about the end? What can you maybe start to think about, right? We think about Keats's poem, When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be. We've talked about that. How do you come to terms with the fact that you haven't met any 200-year-old people? How do you come to terms with the fact that when you were a child, they taught you when you were swinging at the park that you had to go to the van? I don't want to go to the van. No. You don't get to swing at the park forever, man. You got to stay at the park for just a short period of time, then you got to go to the van. Everybody goes to the van. It's going to happen sooner or later. How do you deal with that? Can you learn anything from Phoebus, right? Consider Phoebus, who was once handsome and tall as you. Well, now we come to the end of the poem. We start to put it all together. We're in section 5, What the Thunder Said. And as we get ready to study this, I'll just share with you what T.S. Eliot said in a note about this final and this fifth part. In this, I'm quoting now, in this first part of part 5, 3 themes are employed, so you may want to write this down. The journey to Emmaus. After the resurrection of Christ, there's a story in the gospel account about how Jesus Christ he meets a couple of his disciples on this journey, on a road to Emmaus, but he's not recognized as such. The approach to the Chapel Perilous, and here he references Miss Weston's book that I've already referenced with you as well, and the present day decay of Eastern Europe. That's the one you really want to write down. The decay of Europe, the wasteland. All right, here we go. We'll now turn What the Thunder Said. And again, we're back to that notion of those 3 Sanskrit words. So I have had students that say, I can start to read this a little bit better now by the 5th section because I'm starting to figure out how to read this. Let's see how well you do. Follow along. Best of luck. Here we go. What the Thunder Said, Part 5.
After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace and reverberation of thunder of spring over distant mountains, he who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying, with a little patience. Here is no water, but only rock. Rock and no water and the sandy road, the road winding above among the mountains, which are mountains of rock without water. If there were water, we should stop and drink. Amongst the rock, one cannot stop or think. Sweat is dry and feet are in the sand. If there were only water amongst the rock, dead mountain mouth of carious teeth that cannot spit. Here one can neither stand, nor lie, nor sit. There is not even silence in the mountains, but dry, sterile thunder without rain. There is not even solitude in the mountains, but red, sullen faces sneer and snarl from doors of mud-cracked houses. If there were water and no rock, if there were rock and also water, and water, a spring, a pool among the rock, if there were the sound of water only, not the cicada and dry grass singing, but sound of water over a rock, where the hermit thrush sings in the pine trees, drip, drop, drip, drop, 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 but there is no water. Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together, but when I look ahead up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you. gliding wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman, but who is that on the other side of you? What is that sound high in the air? Murmur of maternal lamentation. Who are those hooded hordes swarming over endless plains, stumbling in cracked earth, ringed by the flat horizon only? What is the city over the mountains? Cracks and reforms and bursts in the violet air, falling towers, Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London, unreal. A woman drew her long black hair out tight and fiddled whisper music on those strings, and bats with baby faces in the violet light whistled and beat their wings, and crawled head downward down a blackened wall, and upside down in air were towers tolling reminiscent bells that kept the hours, and voices singing out of empty cisterns and exhausted wells. In this decayed hole among the mountains, in the faint moonlight, the grass is singing over the tumbled graves about the chapel. There is the empty chapel, only the wind's home. It has no windows, and the door swings. Dry bones can harm no one. Only a cock stood on the roof tree, cocorico, cocorico, in a flash of lightning. Then a damp gust, bringing rain. Ganga was sunken, and the limp leaves waited for rain, while the black clouds gathered far distant over Himavant. The jungle crouched, humped in silence. Then the thunder spoke. Da. Datta. What have we given? My friend, blood shaking my heart, the awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. By this, and this only, we have existed, which is not to be found in our obituaries, or in memories draped by the beneficent spider, or under seals broken by the lean solicitor in our empty rooms. Da. Dayatvam. I have heard the key turn in the door once and turn once only. We think of the key, each in his prison, thinking of the key. Each confirms a prison only at nightfall. Ethereal rumors revive for a moment a broken Coriolanus. Da. Damietta. The boat responded gaily to the hand expert with sail and oar. The sea was calm. Your heart would have responded gaily when invited, beating obedient to controlling hands. I sat upon the shore fishing with the arid plain behind me. Shall I at least set my lands in order? London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. Poi s'ascosi nel fuoco che gli affina, quando fiam ute che li don. Oh, swallow, swallow. Le prince d'Aquitaine à la tour abolie. These fragments I have shored against my ruins. Why, then I'll fit you. Hieronymo's mad again. Datta, Dayadvan, Damietta. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.
All right, let's now turn and to this last and final section. Let's see how well we can maybe spend some time here. Note right away at the very beginning of this last section, note the repetition of the word after, after, after. Do you see it? 3 times we get it. It's going to be an important refrain for us, right? Notice the mention of the mountains, right? Several times mentioned here. At least 4 times mentioned the mountains. Only these are distant mountains. There's a winding road. We'll get to that one in a second. And then mountains of rock, and finally, dead mountain. Notice how different this is from the opening line in the first section, in the mountains, there you feel free. I read much of the night and go south for the winter. This idea of a winding road, right? The winding road above the mountains. Some have said this is a very useful kind of repetition here of an idea, that this is a poem that's kind of winding. And of course, what do we think of as winding in nature? Rivers, of course, come to mind, don't they, right? Point out as well at line 325, you've got repetition of those ing words, right? The shouting, the crying, the gerunds there. Notice we've got the winding, right, taking us back to the opening lines of the poem as well. He who is living is of course is now dead. We are dying with a little patience. We're talking here about Christ, the resurrected Christ. Notice though, we are dying with a little patience. We're back again to this notion that slowly, all life is really about is dying from the moment of your birth. It's all headed towards that experience, which can be kind of understood as a really kind of sad observation, right? Notice, here where we are, only rock. Everything is sterile. There's no water, right? The notion of fear death by water can mean two things. It can mean drowning, but can also mean going without water, dying of thirst, right? Notice at line 346 that there's this word, if. If there were water and no rock. If there was the sound. In other words, this notion of, I wish I had something I didn't have. Ennui, and we're back again to Baudelaire in his poem to the reader. Ennui is not just about boredom. It's about wishing that there was something which probably never can actually come. Notice the dry grass reminds us at line 354 of the dry grass of hollow men. You can go back to that lecture. This notion of who is the third, Christ is not recognized, and I think this is part of that. In hollow men, it's the multifoliate rose of Dante. That notion that if Christ were to come, we think of Dostoevsky's from Brothers Karamazov, and that notion of when, in the Grand Inquisitor chapter, when Christ shows up and nobody recognizes Christ, right? For Dostoevsky, he's walking through the streets, the Inquisition, and nobody recognizes Christ at all, right? On the road to Emmaus, he's not recognized. Line 368, Europe is in chaos, right, for T.S. Eliot. We're back to women's hair again, the long black hair, right? Hey, by the way, notice this one. Line 344 and following, the faces sneer and snarl. We've got clatter and clutter earlier. And then notice the swarming and the stumbling, these repetitions of these words. All of these words have this tendency of a certain kind of feeling. So if we were to ask for your notes at 2B, what is the mood of this poem? Right? Jot that one down. What is the mood of this poem with all these really heavy, kind of sad words, right? The women's hair takes us back again to the observation, and I think probably that T.S. Eliot was influenced by a study of Paradise Lost, the importance of hair all the way through the poem, right? Notice we go from rats to now bats, right? And both of these animals are portrayed then in the worst imaginable ways, right? They live in the dark. They're kind of seen as gross and frightening, and yet those are the animals that end up here. By the way, let's point out that notice how many times the word violet gets used in this poem, and all the other colors, red and white, which takes us back to our comments on Conrad's Heart of Darkness and the use of color. We've got the chapel, which is going to have something to do with the Grail quest. And the idea of the Grail is significant with the Fisher King. Now we haven't said much about that one, so let's put that one in our notes really quickly. The idea from the Arthurian motif is simple. And you can go back to my lectures on King Arthur to see more of this, right? Hear more of this. King Arthur is dying. The only thing that can help to save him is to drink from the Grail. But the Grail can't be found. So the knights have to go out and search for the Grail. And when they finally find it, and of course the only one who can find it is the greatest of the purest of the knights, Percival, and he'll bring it back. And then, and only then, can you drink the water that's drunk from the Grail, for those of you who know your Indiana Jones and the third film, of course, when he drinks from the cup, of Christ. When you drink then from this Holy Grail, then you have water that will restore you. Not drown you, but restore you in some way. And we're clearly there. Then there's a flash. Oh, I'm sorry. We want to make a comment about the cock that stood on the rooftop. Remember, of course, that you have a chicken, a rooster. Remember, the cock crowing is very important in Christian story about the denial of Christ by the great Peter, right? Right as the cock crows 3 times. So we're playing, all kinds of games are being played here at the conclusion of our poem, right? We've got empty voices, we've got exhausted wells, and then finally we've got the river. The Ganga River, the river of India by the waters of Leman were earlier mentioned, and of course that took us to Psalm 137 by the waters of Babylon. There we sat down and wept, playing very similar games. And then finally, we've got the theophany. Now a theophany again, coming here from the Upanishads 5.1, the theophany again is significant, right? Because it's when God speaks out of the thunderstorm or out of the whirlwind. In this case, out of the thunder. And again, just to be clear, datta means to give. Dayamva means to be compassionate, sympathize. And dayamna, to control, right? So you've got this game that's being played here. The awful daring of a moment's surrender takes us back to Prufrock and his Do I Dare Disturb the Universe. Notice the line here about the empty rooms. We think of the key, each in his prison, thinking of the key, each confirms a prison, only at nightfall. Ethereal rumors. The idea that we live our lives somehow separated from everyone else, in our own